Hello. I told my fiancée she was getting too close to her male best friend. She replied, "You're just insecure. He was in my life before you. If you make me choose, I'll choose him every time." So I made my decision. I called off the wedding and cut them both out. For months later, she showed up again, pregnant and in tears. "My name is Brad. I am 31, and I work as a residential home inspector in Charleston. My days are structured around appointments, crawling through attics, checking foundations, and writing detailed reports that people rely on before making expensive decisions. It is steady work, early starts, and I tend to keep a predictable routine outside of that. I'm not big on going out, and I always thought that made me easy to build a life with. My fiancée is Julia, 29. We had been together a little over 3 years when this started becoming impossible to ignore. We were not married yet, but the venue was booked, deposits were paid, and we had already been living together for just under a year in the townhouse I was renting before she moved in. I am posting because I want outside opinions, but I also need to lay this out clearly because every time I tried to bring it up, the conversation got flipped back on me. According to Julia, I was not noticing anything real. I was being insecure. According to me, the pattern was the problem. The issue was her best friend, Owen. He is 33, single, and the kind of guy who always manages to be present without doing anything obvious enough to call out in one clean sentence. He was not some distant friend she saw once in a while. He was built into her weekly routine. Coffee before work some mornings, gym check-ins, late phone calls, random errands together that somehow stretched into half the day. If she had a stressful day, he knew before I did. If something good happened, he usually heard it first. At first I tried to be reasonable. I met him, stayed polite, included him when it made sense. I am not someone who thinks men and women cannot be friends. But there is a difference between friendship and priority, and after a while it felt like I was adjacent to my own relationship instead of actually in it. What bothered me most was not obvious flirting. It was ranking. He came first in ways she acted like I was too petty to notice. She canceled on me twice in 1 month because of him, once because he had a rough day and once because he did not want to go alone to an event. Meanwhile, if I asked for one evening where her phone was not lighting up from him every few minutes, I got told I was making things weird. Then there was a dinner at her friend Tessa's place. The night I stopped questioning myself and started paying attention to details I probably should have caught earlier. The strange part is that Owen was the one who gave me the first real clue, and I do not think he even realized it. Tessa's place is one of those renovated older homes near downtown, the kind where everything looks casual but is actually planned down to the smallest detail. There were about 10 people there, mostly her friends, a couple of partners, and Owen showed up about 20 minutes after we did. Julia lit up when he walked in. Not in a dramatic way, just a shift that was noticeable if you were paying attention. I stayed consistent. I greeted him, shook his hand, asked him how he had been. He gave me the same relaxed energy he always does, like we were on neutral terms. Nothing openly disrespectful. That is part of what made it hard to explain later. There was never one obvious moment you could point to and say that crossed a line. We all settled into the evening, food, drinks, people rotating between the kitchen and the living room. Julia drifted toward Owen pretty quickly. Again, nothing dramatic, just proximity. They stood close, leaned in to talk, shared things on their phones. I made a point not to hover. I talked to other people, stayed engaged, but I kept track of time. About an hour in, I realized I had barely spoken to her since we arrived. Every time I looked over, she was mid-conversation with him. Not a group conversation either. It was always just the two of them, angled slightly away from everyone else. At one point I walked over to refill my drink and ended up next to them. I caught the tail end of something Owen said. He mentioned a place they used to go to all the time and then said something about how it had not been the same since she moved in with me. He said it casually, like it was an established fact. Julia laughed and nudged him, but she did not correct it. She did not include me. She did not even acknowledge that I was standing right there. It was a small moment, but it stuck. The way he framed it made it sound like I had disrupted something ongoing between them, not like I was her partner. I asked what they were talking about, keeping my tone neutral. Julia gave a short summary that skipped over most of the context, like I was catching up on a conversation I was not really part of. Owen filled in a detail, but again, it was phrased in a way that assumed history I was not included in. I stepped away after that, not to make a scene, just to reset and watch more carefully. Patterns matter more than isolated comments. Over the next 40 minutes, I noticed the same thing repeat. Inside jokes, shared references, a kind of familiarity that went beyond normal friendship. The part that shifted things for me was when Tessa made a comment across the room asking if Julia was still splitting her weekends the same way. It sounded like a joke, but it landed differently once I processed it. Julia brushed it off quickly, almost too quickly, and changed the subject. I did not react in the moment. I stayed through the rest of the dinner, kept things calm, drove us home like nothing was wrong. But by the time we pulled into the driveway, I had already made up my mind that I was not going to let this sit as a vague feeling anymore. I was going to ask direct questions and get direct answers that same night. Once we got back to the townhouse, I did not drag it out. It was already late, and I prefer dealing with things while the details are still fresh instead of letting them turn into something vague by morning. Julia kicked off her shoes, went straight to the kitchen, and started scrolling through her phone like the night had been completely normal. I gave it a minute, then I asked her if we could talk. She sighed before I even finished the sentence, which already told me how the conversation was going to go. I kept it simple. I told her I had been noticing a pattern for a while, and tonight just made it clearer. I said she was getting too close to Owen in ways that did not feel appropriate for someone who was about to get married. She did not even hesitate. She leaned back against the counter, crossed her arms, and gave me this look like I had just confirmed something negative about myself. She said I was being insecure, not in a defensive tone, just flat, like it was an objective fact she was pointing out. Then she added that Owen had been in her life before me, and that I needed to respect that instead of trying to compete with it. I told her I was not trying to compete with anyone. I was pointing out specific behaviors. The time they spent together, the way she prioritized him, the way I was being sidelined in my own relationship. I gave examples from that night and from the past few weeks. She brushed all of it off. Every example turned into me misinterpreting something. Every concern became me overthinking. She did not engage with the substance at all. She stayed focused on the idea that the problem was how I was perceiving things, not what was actually happening. That is when I made it direct. I told her I was not comfortable continuing toward marriage with things staying like this. I said if there were no boundaries, then there was a real problem. I asked her plainly where I stood compared to him. She did not soften. If anything, she seemed irritated that I was pushing it to a clear answer. She said if I was going to frame it like a choice, then I needed to be ready for the answer. Then she said it. Calm, almost bored. She said if I made her choose, she would choose him every time. There was no hesitation, no attempt to walk it back, no awareness of how final that sounded. Just a statement, like she was clarifying something obvious. I did not argue after that. There was nothing left to debate. The situation was clear in a way it had not been before. I nodded, said okay, and went upstairs. Not to cool off, not to think it over again. I already had the information I needed. The only thing left was deciding what I was going to do with it, and I made that decision faster than she expected. I did not sleep on it. That matters, because I know how people tend to frame decisions like this afterward. They call it impulsive or emotional. This was neither. She gave me a clear answer to a direct question, and I treated it as reliable information. I went upstairs and started gathering all her things. Not just a small bag. I mean systematically going through drawers, the closet, the bathroom, separating what was hers from what was mine. I kept it organized, folding clothes, putting everything into boxes and bags so there would be no reason for her to come back later and drag things out. She came upstairs about 10 minutes later and stopped in the doorway when she saw what I was doing. She asked what I thought I was doing, but her tone was more annoyed than confused, like I was creating unnecessary drama. I told her directly that if she was choosing him every time, then there was no reason for her to stay here as my fiancée. I said I was not going to compete for that position, and I was not going to move forward with a wedding under those conditions. She immediately pushed back. She said I was overreacting, that I was taking one sentence and blowing up the entire relationship. I kept it simple and reminded her it was not one sentence. It was a pattern, and that sentence just confirmed where I stood in it. She tried to reframe it as me giving her an ultimatum. I corrected that. I told her I already asked the question and she already answered it. This was just me acting on that answer. I kept packing while we talked. No raised voices, no pacing, just steady movement. It made the situation feel more real than any argument would have. At one point she told me to stop, like she expected me to pause and reconsider. I did not. I finished boxing up what was hers in the bedroom, then moved through the rest of the townhouse. Kitchen items she brought, personal things in the living room, everything separated cleanly. When I was done, I brought everything downstairs and set it near the door. I told her she could call someone to pick her up or arrange a ride herself, but she was not staying there that night. The lease and utilities were all in my name, and there was no practical reason to delay it. She stood there for a moment, like she was waiting for me to walk it back. When I did not, she grabbed her phone and started texting someone, already irritated. I did not ask who. At that point, it did not matter. By the next morning, I had already started canceling the wedding. Within 48 hours, everything was shut down, and both her and Owen were blocked. It was abrupt, but it was clean, and at the time I assumed that was the end of it. The first week after that was quieter than I expected. No messages, no attempts to reach out from unknown numbers, nothing through mutual friends. Given how confident Julia had been in that conversation, I assumed she had shifted straight into relying on Owen, and that was that. From a practical standpoint, things were simple. She had taken everything that was clearly hers. A few small items were left behind, mostly things that had blended into the apartment over time, but nothing important enough to justify reopening contact. I boxed those up and put them in a closet. I also changed a few things immediately. Passwords, access to shared subscriptions, anything that had overlap. Not out of paranoia, just standard cleanup. When you remove someone from your life that quickly, you close every loose end at the same time. Work stayed steady, which helped. My job is detail-oriented, and it does not really allow for distraction. If I miss something during an inspection, it has consequences for someone else. That kept my focus where it needed to be during the day, and by the time I got home, I was too tired to replay conversations. There were a couple of moments where the absence was noticeable, but not in the way people usually describe. It was more logistical than emotional. Fewer groceries needed. Less noise. No background calls happening in the evening. The space felt more controlled. About 2 weeks in, I ran into Tessa at a coffee place near one of my inspection sites. It was not planned. She recognized me. We exchanged basic conversation, and then she asked, carefully, what had happened. I gave her a short version. Not the entire breakdown, just the key point. I told her Julia made it clear where I stood compared to Owen, and I acted accordingly. Tessa did not seem surprised. That stood out to me. She did not defend Julia. She did not try to reframe it. She just nodded and said that things between Julia and Owen had always been more complicated than they let people see. She stopped there, like she had already said enough. I did not push for details. At that point, it would not have changed anything I had already done. After that conversation, I had a clearer sense that I had not misread the situation. If anything, I had probably tolerated it longer than I should have. That made it easier to stay consistent with the decision. By the end of the first month, it felt settled. Not resolved in some emotional sense, just structurally finished. No contact, no overlap, no shared plans left to unwind. So when 4 months passed without hearing anything, I assumed that was permanent. Which is why when there was a knock on my door late on a Tuesday evening, I was not expecting it to be her standing there. It was around 8 in the evening, and I had just finished going through reports for the next day. I was not expecting anyone. I do not get unannounced visitors, and the timing alone made it unusual. When I opened the door, it was Julia. She looked different, but not in a vague way. Tired, visibly worn down, like the last few months had not gone the way she expected. Her posture was off, shoulders slightly forward, and she was holding her arms close to her body like she was trying to stay contained. Then I noticed her stomach. Not something you could miss once you registered it. She was pregnant, far enough along that it was obvious without guessing. That detail alone shifted the situation from unexpected to very specific, very quickly. She did not start with an apology. She started crying almost immediately, like she had been holding it together just long enough to get to my door. It was not subtle. Full emotional release, tears, uneven breathing, the kind of thing that usually pulls people into reacting first and thinking second. I did not step aside to let her in. I stayed where I was and asked her what she needed. Not cold, just direct. Given how things ended, I was not going to default to letting her back into my space without a clear reason. She tried to speak a couple of times before getting a full sentence out. When she did, it was fragmented. She said things had not worked out the way she thought. She said she made a mistake. She said she needed to talk to me. I asked her a more specific question. I asked if the child was Owen's. She hesitated. Not long, but long enough to answer the question without words. Then she nodded. That confirmed the timeline in a way I did not need to overanalyze. For months since I ended things, and she was already far enough along that it lined up with when we were still together. I did not react emotionally to that in the moment. It was just information being placed into a structure that already existed. The dinner, the pattern, her answer that night. It all connected cleanly. She started explaining without me asking. She said Owen had pulled away, that he was not ready for responsibility, that he had told her he needed space. She said she had nowhere stable to go long term, and that things had become overwhelming. Then she said she did not know who else to turn to. That part one registered carefully. Not that she wanted to fix things. Not that she realized something about our relationship. Just that she had run out of better options. I asked her one more question before deciding anything. I asked her why she was at my door specifically, given everything she had said to me the last time we spoke. She wiped her face, looked at me like I was supposed to already understand, and said I was the only stable person she knew. That answer clarified the situation more than anything else she had said so far. I stayed in the doorway the entire time. That was deliberate. Letting her inside would have changed the situation immediately, and I had no intention of creating any confusion about where things stood. I listened to what she said without interrupting, but I did not engage with it the way she seemed to expect. Once she finished explaining, I kept my response direct. I told her I understood that her situation had changed, but mine had not. I said she made her position clear 4 months ago, and I acted on it. That outcome was not temporary, and it was not open for revision now that things had not worked out on her end. She tried to push back, saying it was not that simple, that I was ignoring everything we had built. I let her talk, but I did not adjust anything in my stance. Then I made it clear. I told her she was not coming back inside, not for the night, not temporarily, not under any condition. I said it calmly, without raising my voice, but in a way that left no room for interpretation. That is when her tone shifted. The crying turned sharper, more frustrated. She said I was being cold, that anyone with basic decency would not turn someone away in her position. I did not argue with the framing. I just restated the boundary. I told her I was not responsible for fixing the consequences of decisions she made after dismissing mine. I said there were other options available to her, but I was not one of them. She stood there for a few seconds, like she was waiting for me to soften or reconsider. When that did not happen, she tried one last angle, bringing up the time we spent together, the fact that we were supposed to get married, like that should change the outcome now. It did not. I told her that same history included her telling me she would choose him every time. I said I believed her then, and I still did. That was the last thing I needed to say. There was a pause after that. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet moment where it was clear the conversation was finished. She wiped her face, adjusted her bag, and her expression changed from emotional to flat. Not calm, just closed off. She did not argue again. She turned around and walked away without saying anything else. I closed the door, locked it, and that was it. No follow-up, no message afterward, no attempt to reopen the conversation. The situation ended the same way it started, with a clear decision, followed by action. After she left, things went back to being quiet again, but not in the same way as before. The first time, it felt like a clean break. This time, it felt confirmed. I did not follow up with her, and she did not try to contact me again. No messages from unknown numbers, no emails, nothing through mutual contacts. Given how direct the conversation at the door had been, I was not expecting anything different. The next few days were uneventful. Work stayed the same, my routine stayed the same, and I did not make any adjustments beyond what I had already done months earlier. If anything, I was more certain that ending things when I did was the correct move, not just a reasonable one. About a week later, I ran into Tessa again, this time more intentionally. I had a question, and she was one of the few people who might actually give a straight answer without trying to protect Julia. We met for coffee, and I told her briefly that Julia had shown up at my place. I did not go into every detail, just enough to explain the situation. Tessa did not look surprised this time either, which was consistent with her reaction before. I asked her directly how long things between Julia and Owen had actually been blurred. Not rumors, not guesses, just what she had personally observed. Tessa took a second before answering, like she was deciding how much to say. Then she told me that from her perspective, it had been crossing lines well before I ever brought it up. Not necessarily in a way that was obvious to outsiders, but enough that people close to Julia had noticed. She mentioned weekends where Julia would say she was busy, but end up spending most of her time with Owen. Late-night calls that were not casual, plans that were adjusted around him more often than anyone else. None of it was presented as one big event. It was a collection of smaller choices that added up over time. I asked if there was ever a point where it became clearly physical. Tessa said she did not have proof of that, but she also said it would not have surprised her given how things were trending. That answer lined up with everything I had already pieced together. The timeline, the behavior, the way Julia responded when I confronted her. It all pointed in the same direction. What stood out most was that none of this seemed sudden. It was not like something changed overnight after I left. It looked more like something that had been developing gradually while I was still there, and I just chose to address it when it became undeniable. After that conversation, there was nothing left to question. No loose ends, no missing context that would have changed the outcome. I went back to my routine, and this time it actually felt finished. Not just quiet, but closed. The only thing left was dealing with the fact that the version of the relationship I thought I had was not the one I was actually in. What settled in over the next couple of weeks was not anger. It was adjustment. The situation was already resolved from a practical standpoint, but there is still a process of recalibrating how you evaluate things after something like that. I went back over the timeline once, not repeatedly. Just enough to check if I had missed anything major or ignored something obvious. The answer was no. The signs were there. I addressed them directly. I got a clear response. Then I acted on it. There was no gap where a different decision would have led to a better outcome. If anything, the later confirmation made it clear that delaying would have made things worse. The overlap between her relationship with me and whatever was developing with Owen was already there. I just chose not to tolerate it once it became explicit. A couple of mutual acquaintances reached out indirectly during that time. Nothing confrontational, more like casual check-ins that were clearly meant to gather information. I kept my responses consistent and minimal. We ended things because of incompatible priorities. That was enough. I did hear, secondhand, that Julia had moved in with a friend temporarily after things with Owen fell apart. No long-term plan, just short-term arrangements. I did not follow up on that or try to verify details. It did not change anything on my end. The part that stood out most, looking back, was how predictable the outcome actually was once you remove the emotional framing. She prioritized him when things were easy. He stepped back when things required responsibility. That left her looking for stability somewhere else. I just happened to be the closest previous option. That is why her showing up at my door did not feel random after the fact. It followed a pattern. When one option failed, she moved to the next most stable one available. The difference was that I had already removed myself from that rotation. By that point, my routine felt normal again. Work, home, a few consistent habits. No interruptions, no unresolved conversations waiting to happen. It was not about moving on in some dramatic sense. It was just returning to a structure that made sense. The last thing I did, mainly for completeness, was clear out the box of small items she had left behind months earlier. I donated what could be donated and disposed of the rest. No reason to keep anything that would invite unnecessary contact later. After that, there was nothing left tying the situation to my day-to-day life. And that was the point where it stopped being a recent event and became something that had already been handled. At this point, there is not really an ongoing situation, which is why I am posting this more as a final check than a request for immediate advice. Everything that needed to be decided has already been decided, and everything that needed to be done has already been done. There is no contact between me and Julia, and there has not been since the night she showed up at my door. There is no overlap left in terms of housing, finances, or shared plans. Structurally, it is finished. What I have been thinking about more recently is not whether I made the right call, but how early the outcome was actually determined. Looking back, the key moment was not when she showed up pregnant. It was not even the dinner at Tessa's place. It was the conversation in my kitchen when I asked a direct question and got a direct answer. She told me clearly where I stood. There was no confusion in what she said, and there was no hesitation. If I forced a choice, she would choose him every time. That statement removed any ambiguity. Everything that happened after that just followed the logic of that answer. If I had ignored it, minimized it, or tried to negotiate around it, the end result would not have changed. It would have just been delayed and probably more complicated. Her coming back months later did not introduce new information. It confirmed the pattern. She prioritized him when it suited her, and when that option stopped working, she looked for stability somewhere else. I was not interested in being a fallback. The only part one have had to process is accepting that the version of the relationship I thought I was in did not match reality for a while before I addressed it. Not in a dramatic way, just in terms of recognizing that consistent small behaviors matter more than isolated reassurances. At this point, my life is back to being predictable. Work is steady, my routine is intact, and there is no ongoing situation connected to this. So I guess the reason I am posting is simple. I want to know if there is anything in how I handled this that I am not seeing. Not emotionally, but logically. From my perspective, I asked a clear question, got a clear answer, and acted in a way that was consistent with it. When she came back later under different circumstances, I stayed consistent with that same decision. If there is a flaw in that approach, I would rather see it now than repeat it later. Bye-bye.